Hi, this is Terry from Bonsai Tree again, and today I'm going to be talking about top dressing. Top dressing is something that we use after you've repotted your trees to prevent, well, in fact it actually has a number of positive or beneficial uses. The one thing is that it of course stabilizes the top layer of soil so it doesn't move around too much when you're watering, and it also creates the perfect growing medium or environment for green or living mosses to grow. Top dressing is also great for encouraging surface roots. Otherwise, without top dressing, very often you'll find that the fine root hairs will develop, or your roots will grow down into the soil, and you won't really find surface roots at the top. The process of making top dressing is actually very simple. You're just going to need some sphagnum moss and some green moss. And the green live moss you can collect from various sources. You can look for it in gutters, you can look for it on the soil in fairly shady areas, but it's also a great idea to collect moss from other bonsai trees that you have in your collection, if you have a collection of trees, because that you get many different types of mosses. And some mosses will grow better in the kind of conditions and climate and environment that you are going to be providing to them when they're planted around the bonsai tree. The first step in making or preparing is probably going to be to collect some green moss, and you are going to dry it out. The other thing is that you're going to have to take your sphagnum moss, so you're going to also have to dry that out. My recommendation would be to start making your top dressing and then just store it in a bag until you start transplanting or repotting your trees in spring. Take the dried sphagnum moss, and you're going to use one of the screens, the coarser screens in the sieve set, and you're just going to grate the moss on the screen so that you break up the long fiber. The next step is to replace the mesh or the screen in your sieve, and to take the grated sphagnum and sift it again, because what you want to do now is to get all the fine material out. You don't want that in your top dressing, because that fine material is going to sink down into your growing media. So this is the final sphagnum moss product that you are going to use. Here I have an assortment of mosses which I've collected from various places. I didn't have the chance to dry it out, so do as I say and not as I do in this particular instance. So just as we grated the dried sphagnum moss, we are now going to take the live moss and grate that. And of course the reason why we want to use the live moss is because sphagnum moss itself is not going to grow. It's been treated, so it'll never grow again. It might turn a little bit green, but it will never grow. So what we want to do is we want to get green moss and sort of inoculate the sphagnum moss with green or living moss spores, and then you will actually find that this moss will then grow within the sphagnum moss top dressing. The very big difference between growing living moss into a substrate of sphagnum moss, for instance, is that it actually grows in it, so it roots itself well into the sphagnum moss and it will develop. If you go and collect pieces, what a lot of people do or did do is they would collect pieces of green moss, and then they would place those pieces of moss on the surface around their trees. The problem is that moss is not rooted into the substrate or into the growing medium that they're using. So the first bit of heat that we get, bit of sun, that moss dries out and it just cools up on the edges, and it really looks unsightly. Whereas this method will actually allow you or provide moss that's growing on the surface. The last step now is just to remove the sand. So you're going to use a much finer sieve, and of course this works a lot better when the moss is dry, because then the sand just easily falls through the screen. The final step of making the top dressing is to mix the sphagnum moss and the live moss together. In this way you now have inoculated the sphagnum moss with the living moss, and you don't really need a lot of live moss. I don't really have a ratio or proportion, a cup to 1 liter or something like that. The green moss is of course a spore, and so will populate the whole surface eventually but I don't measure it at all. It's just you're inoculating it, so you just need to put a reasonable quantity in. So after you've done your repotting, you then just want to sprinkle your top dressing around the tree, and you need to put it down to roughly 5 millimeter or a couple of millimeters, a layer of around the tree. And then finally, once you've applied the top dressing, you can then water your tree thoroughly, and this will also just compact the top dressing down, and it sort of forms a mat on the surface, so it doesn't come off easily after that, even if you water quite harshly.